An 8-foot alien queen mocked breeding with a lone human until his quiet humanity changed her fate. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. Ethan Walker stood exactly where the floor markings told him to stand, boots aligned with the thin blue line embedded in the alloy deck, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing steady despite the pressure hum that vibrated through the chamber walls. The chamber was vast, taller than a 3-story building, its ceiling arched like the inside of a cathedral built by engineers instead of priests, lit by bands of cold white light that reflected off translucent panels filled with drifting data. Temperature readouts hovered at a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable for humans, clinically optimized for everyone else. Ethan had learned that comfort here was always intentional, always calculated. Across the room, elevated on a circular dais, Queen Zyrith regarded him with an expression that hovered between curiosity and amusement. She was every bit 8 feet tall, long-limbed, her posture effortless, her presence bending the air around her the way heat bends light above asphalt. Her people measured authority in posture and stillness, and she had mastered both. The surrounding attendants stood motionless, faces neutral, eyes tracking biometrics scrolling invisibly across their retinal displays. Ethan was aware of the data streaming about him, heart rate at 62 beats per minute, oxygen saturation perfect, stress hormones elevated but controlled. He had nothing to hide, and nothing to prove. The Queen's voice carried easily without amplification, low and even, resonating off the chamber's curved surfaces. She spoke of compatibility, of probabilities, of outcomes expressed in decimals that stretched toward zero. She spoke of humans as variables, interesting but inefficient, adaptable but biologically inelegant. When she laughed, it wasn't cruel. It was dismissive, the sound someone makes when closing a book they've already finished reading. Ethan listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that silence could be a form of respect, and sometimes a form of strength. He noticed small things instead, a slight fluctuation in the thermal field around the dais, a delayed response in one of the environmental regulators, the way the Queen's attendance subtly shifted when a warning icon flickered and vanished. When the laughter faded, and the chamber settled back into its measured quiet, Ethan took a single step forward, not out of defiance, but because the regulator nearest the dais was cycling inefficiently. He asked permission with a glance toward the nearest attendant, received a fractional nod, and knelt beside the access panel. His fingers moved with practiced ease, loosening a latch, reseating a connector, adjusting a setting by half a degree. The hum smoothed. The temperature stabilized. The change was minor, almost invisible, but the relief it brought was real. He stood again where he belonged, hands relaxed, gaze level. The Queen regarded him anew. Her expression did not soften, but something in her focus sharpened, as if a lens had been adjusted. She asked him why he had done it. Ethan answered simply that systems worked better when they were cared for, and that discomfort made clear thinking harder for everyone. There was no lecture in his tone, no appeal. Just an observation, delivered like a fact. Around them, the data streams recalculated. Probabilities shifted by margins too small to matter, or so the algorithms believed. Ethan felt the weight of the room, the scrutiny, the expectations pressed into silence. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He waited. And in that waiting, something subtle changed, not in the numbers scrolling across the walls, but in the space between them, where for the first time, the Queen did not look down at a human as a variable, but across at him as a presence. Ethan was escorted from the chamber not by guards but by light itself as the floor indicators shifted and guided him through a corridor that curved gently downward, the architecture subtly directing without ever touching, a design philosophy he had come to recognize as Zyraethian. The air changed as he walked, humidity rising slightly, a warmer note layered into the recycled atmosphere, calibrated not for comfort but for endurance. He noticed it because noticing was his habit. The chamber behind him sealed with a sound like a held breath finally released, and for a moment he stood alone, the faint vibration of distant machinery traveling up through the soles of his boots. He did not know whether he had been dismissed or postponed, and he accepted that uncertainty without protest. A lesser mind might have replayed the Queen's laughter, the way it had echoed off the walls, but Ethan's thoughts stayed practical. He catalogued the inefficiencies he had seen, the regulator that would need a longer-term fix, the data lag in the attendance displays. Small problems, solvable ones. He followed the corridor until it opened into a service atrium where translucent panels revealed the slow movement of coolant streams and energy conduits, glowing softly like veins beneath skin. There, a single attendant waited, posture formal but eyes curious, and informed Ethan that he had been assigned temporary quarters within the inner complex. Temporary meant conditional. It always did. The quarters were modest by Zyroethian standards and generous by human ones, a room with smooth walls that adjusted opacity at a spoken request, a rest platform that molded to body heat, a terminal offering restricted access to system diagnostics. Ethan set his small kit down, running a hand over the surface of the platform to feel how it responded, then sat, boots still on, elbows on his knees. Time passed differently here. There was no window, no cycle of light to suggest morning or night, only the steady rhythm of the station itself. When the summons came, it was quiet, a soft tone that resonated through the walls rather than a voice. Ethan rose immediately. The corridor this time led upward, back toward the central spire, but not to the ceremonial chamber. Instead, he was guided to a smaller environment, a private observation room overlooking a section of the station's core. Queen Zyrith stood alone there, no attendants, no visible displays, her attention fixed on the slow rotation of the core structures below. She did not turn when Ethan entered, but she acknowledged his presence with a subtle shift of her shoulders, an invitation to speak that he did not take. Silent stretched, not uncomfortable, simply present. Finally, she asked him if humans always interfered with systems that were not theirs. Ethan considered the question carefully before answering that humans tended to fix what they understood and to learn what they did not, and that sometimes those two things happened at the same time. He did not mention altruism or duty. He spoke as if describing weather. The Queen turned then, studying him from a distance that would have intimidated anyone else. She asked if he understood why he had been brought here. Ethan replied that he understood the stated purpose, but that stated purposes were often incomplete. That answer earned him a pause, a moment where her expression shifted, not into warmth but into something like recalibration. She told him that her people valued outcomes above intentions, results above sentiment, and that his species often confused those priorities. Ethan said that sometimes intentions were the variable that changed the outcome. He did not argue further. He waited. The station hummed around them, power flows steady, temperatures balanced, systems running within optimal parameters. The Queen glanced toward the core again, then back to him, and asked a question that was not in any briefing, not in any data set, not in any model Ethan had seen. She asked him whether humans chose their bonds or whether they were assigned. Ethan answered without hesitation that humans chose, often poorly, often against advice, but that the choice itself mattered more than the efficiency of the result. The Queen was silent after that. Somewhere deep within the station, a system recalculated, adjusting projections by fractions so small they were almost meaningless. Almost. Ethan remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, aware that whatever happened next would not be decided by numbers alone. Ethan did not return to his quarters after the audience ended because the station did not instruct him to do so, and in this place instruction mattered more than habit. Instead, the corridors shifted again, guiding him along a path he had not taken before, deeper into the inner complex where the lighting softened and the ambient hum dropped to a lower register that he felt more in his chest than his ears. This sector smelled faintly metallic, clean but lived in, the scent of systems that ran continuously without ceremony. He noticed maintenance markers along the walls, coded in a language he did not read but whose logic he understood well enough to follow. When he reached the threshold indicated by a subtle change in floor texture, he stopped automatically, waiting. The door did not open. A moment passed, then another. Ethan remained still. Patience, he had learned, was a language that translated well across species. The door finally parted with a smooth, quiet motion, revealing a narrow control gallery overlooking a lattice of diagnostic chambers below. Queen Zyrith stood at the railing, one hand resting lightly against the surface as if grounding herself. She did not look at him when she spoke, asking whether humans measured worth by success or by persistence. Ethan answered that humans argued about that endlessly and that the argument itself was part of how they decided who they were. The queen made a sound that might have been amusement or might have been dismissal, then gestured toward the chambers below, where complex arrays pulsed with regulated light. She explained, without embellishment, that her people had reached a biological plateau, that optimization had brought them stability but not certainty, and that stability without growth was merely a slower form of decline. Ethan listened, eyes tracking the light patterns, recognizing feedback loops that were too perfect, too closed. He said carefully that closed systems eventually ran out of room to surprise themselves. The queen turned then, studying him with an intensity that made the air feel denser. She asked whether surprise was valuable. Ethan replied that it was uncomfortable, inefficient, and frequently inconvenient, and that it was also the source of most things humans later called progress. She considered that in silence. A soft alert chimed somewhere below, a minor deviation flagged and corrected almost instantly by the station systems. Ethan felt a familiar itch at the back of his mind, the instinct to intervene even when intervention was unnecessary. He did not act on it. Instead, he asked permission to observe more closely. The queen hesitated, then nodded once. He moved to a secondary console, careful not to overstep, and watched as the data flowed. Patterns repeated with minor variations that never crossed preset thresholds. It was elegant. It was safe. It was static. Ethan commented on a redundant safeguard that, while effective, masked early indicators of divergence. He spoke softly, as if describing a flaw in a well-made tool rather than critiquing a civilization. The queen listened. She asked him what humans did when safeguards failed. Ethan said that sometimes they failed with them and sometimes they learned why they had needed them in the first place. The answer did not satisfy her, but it intrigued her. She dismissed the console with a gesture and stepped closer, closing the distance between them to something almost conversational. She asked him if he understood the role he had been brought to fill. Ethan said that he understood the theory and that he suspected the practice would be different. That earned him a long look, measuring, weighing. She told him that her people did not choose lightly and that mockery was often a test rather than a verdict. Ethan absorbed that without reaction. He said that humans often tested themselves instead, usually by trying something they had been told would not work. The station's core shifted below them, a slow, deliberate movement that cast changing light across the queen's features. For the first time, Ethan noticed fatigue there, not physical but conceptual, the weariness of certainty held too long. She asked him what he would do if his presence proved statistically irrelevant. Ethan answered that he would continue to do what he could see needed doing until he was told otherwise. There was no defiance in his voice, only resolve. The queen turned back to the railing, gazed distant, and said quietly that such persistence was inefficient. Ethan agreed. He added that it was also human. The word lingered between them, not as a claim of superiority but as a statement of fact. Somewhere in the system, another projection adjusted by a fraction. This time, the adjustment was not immediately corrected. Ethan's access privileges expanded the following cycle, not announced but implied by the way doors opened a fraction sooner and consoles no longer dimmed when he approached, subtle permissions granted without ceremony. He noticed because he always did. He began his days, if they could be called that, moving through the inner complex with a quiet purpose, correcting minor inefficiencies, documenting deviations that the larger system smoothed over too quickly. He did not present reports unless asked. He simply left systems better than he found them. The station responded in kind, power flows stabilizing, environmental fluctuations narrowing, the overall rhythm tightening into something closer to harmony than control. Queen Zyrith observed these changes from a distance at first, reviewing summaries stripped of attribution, patterns without a name attached. When she finally asked who had authorized the adjustments, the answer came back with a single identifier that surprised her less than it should have. She summoned Ethan again, this time not to a chamber or gallery, but to a narrow observation deck that overlooked a living biome designed to replicate conditions from her homeworld. The air there was warmer, heavier, carrying a faint organic scent that reminded Ethan of greenhouses back on Earth. The Queen stood barefoot on the smooth surface, posture relaxed in a way he had not seen before, as if the formality of her role loosened slightly in this space. She asked him whether humans modified environments to suit themselves or whether they adapted to what they found. Ethan answered that humans did both, often at the same time, and that the tension between adaptation and modification was where most mistakes and most discoveries happened. She asked him to walk with her along the deck. He matched her pace without comment, long strides balanced against her height with ease born of attention rather than confidence. As they walked, she spoke of lineage and expectation, of a role defined before birth and reinforced by every system around her, a function optimized until it left no room for doubt. Ethan listened, hands clasped loosely behind his back, eyes tracking the slow movement of engineered flora below. He said that humans also inherited expectations, though theirs were less precise and often contradictory, and that many spent their lives negotiating with invisible rules they had never agreed to. The Queen stopped, turning to face him fully. She asked him if negotiation ever produced clarity. Ethan said that sometimes it produced compromise and sometimes it produced change, and that clarity was often something people recognized only after they had acted without it. The biome lighting shifted subtly, responding to internal cycles rather than conversation, but the timing felt meaningful all the same. She told him that her people valued certainty because certainty preserved stability, and that instability had nearly destroyed them generations ago. Ethan acknowledged that fear made sense, that caution was a reasonable response to loss, but he added that fear could become outdated long after the threat that created it had passed. He did not soften the statement. He did not sharpen it either. The Queen looked away, gaze distant, as if measuring history against possibility. A minor alert chimed softly at the edge of the deck, indicating a deviation in one of the biome regulators. Ethan noticed immediately, stepping toward the console out of habit, then stopping himself, glancing to the Queen for permission. She hesitated, then nodded. He adjusted the regulator with minimal input, explaining as he did so that the system was compensating too aggressively, preventing natural variation that would strengthen the biome over time. He spoke as if teaching, not persuading, offering information without expectation. When he finished, the biome's microclimate shifted almost imperceptibly, airflow changing, temperature gradients smoothing into something more organic. The Queen observed the result in silence. She asked him whether humans trusted systems. Ethan said that humans trusted systems until those systems failed them, and that even then, they often trusted the wrong parts out of habit. She asked him whether he trusted her systems. Ethan considered, then said that he trusted what he could test and that he respected what he could not yet understand. The answer seemed to settle something in her. As they continued their walk, she told him that mockery was a shield, a way to dismiss possibilities before they demanded consideration. Ethan replied that humans used humor the same way sometimes, to keep unfamiliar ideas at a manageable distance. The Queen stopped again, this time closer to him than before, her presence no longer imposing but deliberate. She asked him whether he felt mocked. Ethan shook his head, saying that he had felt evaluated and that evaluation did not bother him. What mattered was whether the evaluation remained open to revision. The Queen studied him, then looked back out over the biome, where engineered life responded quietly to the changes he had made. She said nothing more, but the silence that followed was different, less like a boundary and more like space. For the first time since Ethan had arrived, the station's projections did not immediately correct a growing divergence. They allowed it to continue, just a little longer. Ethan began to notice the quiet before Queen Zyrith did, the way the station's background cadence softened when they occupied the same space for longer stretches, as if the systems themselves adjusted to a new variable they had not been designed to categorize. Their meetings stopped being summons and became occurrences, moments where paths intersected without formal instruction. Sometimes it was the observation deck, sometimes a transit corridor overlooking the core, once even a maintenance ring where the lighting was dimmer and the walls bore faint marks of past recalibrations. In those places, silence grew more frequent, not as an absence of words but as a shared state neither of them rushed to interrupt. Ethan found that he did not feel watched in those silences. He felt present. Queen Zyrith, for her part, found that the absence of attendance made the air feel lighter, less constrained by expectation. She asked fewer questions framed as tests and more that seemed intended to explore boundaries she had never crossed. On one occasion, she observed Ethan reviewing a stream of environmental data without intervening, simply watching the patterns play out. She asked him why he did not correct a deviation that was trending toward inefficiency. Ethan answered that the system needed room to respond on its own and that immediate correction would teach it nothing. She asked how a system could learn. He replied that learning was what happened when failure was allowed to remain visible long enough to be understood. The answer lingered between them, unsettling and oddly comforting. In another moment, they stood together overlooking the biome, the engineered flora responding gradually to the variations he had introduced. The Queen remarked that the growth patterns were less predictable now. Ethan said that unpredictability often came with resilience and that humans valued resilience because they lived in environments that rarely stayed the same for long. She considered that, then asked him whether humans feared change. Ethan smiled faintly, the expression subtle enough that it might have been missed by anyone not watching closely, and said that humans feared stagnation just as much, though they rarely admitted it. Time continued to pass without markers. The station did not announce cycles, and Ethan stopped trying to count them. He measured time instead by small shifts in behavior, by the way Queen Zyrith no longer dismissed his observations with a glance, by the way she sometimes mirrored his pauses before speaking. Once, during a long interval of shared silence, she asked him what humans did when they were uncertain. Ethan said that sometimes they talked too much and sometimes they did the opposite, choosing to sit with the uncertainty until it clarified itself or until they accepted that it would not. She asked which approach he preferred. Ethan said that he preferred listening, because uncertainty often revealed more when given space. The Queen did not respond immediately. She turned her gaze outward, toward the slow movement of the station's outer structures, and remained there, silent, for a duration that would have been considered inefficient by any metric she had been raised to value. Ethan did not move. He matched her stillness without imitation, simply sharing the moment. The station's systems registered nothing urgent, no thresholds crossed, no alarms triggered. Yet something subtle shifted all the same, a recalibration not of machinery but of attention. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Ethan had heard it before. She said that her people defined bonds by function and outcome, that relationships existed to produce stability and continuity. She asked him whether humans defined bonds differently. Ethan answered that humans defined bonds by choice, even when those choices led to uncertainty or loss, and that the act of choosing was often what gave the bond meaning. The Queen asked whether choice ever weakened commitment. Ethan said that sometimes it did, but that when it did not, it strengthened it beyond what obligation alone could achieve. She absorbed that without comment. In the silence that followed, Ethan became aware of his own breathing, slow and even, and noticed that the Queen's cadence had subtly aligned with his. It was an unremarkable physiological response, meaningless by itself, yet it stood out precisely because no system had prompted it. She observed the alignment too, not with alarm but with curiosity. She asked him whether humans noticed such things. Ethan replied that humans noticed many things they did not fully understand and that noticing did not always require immediate explanation. The Queen nodded once, a small gesture that carried more weight than any declaration. As they stood there, the station allowed another minor deviation to persist, then another, each well within safe parameters yet collectively forming a pattern that was no longer perfectly symmetrical. Ethan did not correct it. Queen Zyrith did not order it corrected. In the quiet between them, the concept of choice settled into place, not as a challenge to her authority but as an addition to it, a variable she had not yet named but was no longer inclined to dismiss. Ethan learned about the council review before it was announced, not through protocol but through the station's behavior, the way certain access routes tightened and the way ambient light shifted toward a more formal spectrum, a visual cue meant to signal importance without explanation. Queen Zyrith noticed it moments later, her posture adjusting almost imperceptibly as inherited reflex met present awareness. She told Ethan that the council would question recent deviations, not because they were dangerous but because they were unexplained, and that unexplained change unsettled those whose authority depended on prediction. Ethan listened, hands loosely clasped, and asked what the council expected from her. She replied that they expected confirmation, reassurance that the systems remained under control and that recent variations were either temporary or irrelevant. Ethan asked what she expected from herself. The question landed with more weight than he intended, and for a moment she did not answer. When she did, she said that she expected clarity, and that clarity had become more difficult to achieve the longer she observed the effects of his presence. The word presence lingered, chosen carefully, not implying ownership or function. They moved to the core observation ring, where the station's structural movements were most visible, vast components rotating with deliberate precision measured in inches per minute. The Queen spoke of legacy, of how her predecessors had secured survival through optimization and how any departure from that path was viewed as risk rather than renewal. Ethan said that humans often mistook continuity for safety and that survival sometimes required redefining what continuity meant. She asked him whether he believed her people were afraid. Ethan considered, then said that fear was not always loud and that sometimes it wore the shape of certainty. The station chimed softly, a scheduled alert marking the approach of the council session. Time, which had felt suspended for so long, pressed forward again. Queen Zyrith turned toward Ethan, her gaze steady, and asked him whether he would alter the systems to hide the deviations, to make the council more comfortable. Ethan answered without hesitation that he would not, and that if the deviations needed explanation, he would explain them. She asked whether he understood the implications of defying expectation. Ethan replied that humans lived with those implications daily and that choosing not to act would be a choice as consequential as any other. She studied him, then nodded, a decision settling behind her eyes. During the council review, Ethan stood at the periphery, not presented as an advisor but not excluded either, his presence noted without comment. The council's inquiries were precise, their language technical, their focus narrow. Queen Zyrith responded with measured calm, acknowledging the deviations and presenting them not as errors but as controlled allowances designed to test long-term resilience. When questioned about the origin of the approach, she did not deflect. She identified Ethan by name and role, describing him as an external perspective introduced intentionally to challenge closed assumptions. The council reacted as expected, caution expressed through layered questions and statistical projections. Ethan listened, recognizing familiar patterns of resistance masked as analysis. When the Queen gestured for him to speak, he did so plainly, explaining the changes in terms of systems theory rather than philosophy, emphasizing measurable outcomes without dismissing uncertainty. He did not argue. He clarified. The council recessed without resolution, a temporary outcome that was, in itself, a shift. When the chamber cleared, the station's ambient settings eased, tension draining from the architecture as if it had been holding its breath. Queen Zyrith remained standing, gaze fixed on the empty seats where authority had just been exercised and, for once, deferred. She said quietly that the council would watch her more closely now. Ethan said that attention often preceded transformation. She asked him whether he regretted speaking. Ethan answered that he regretted nothing that aligned with his understanding of what was needed. The Queen considered that, then said that she had not expected quiet humanity to be disruptive. Ethan replied that disruption was not his intent and that change often arrived that way anyway. As they stood together, the station's projections updated again, incorporating new variables that extended beyond immediate optimization. For the first time, the models did not converge quickly. They branched, offering multiple viable futures instead of a single predicted path. Queen Xyrith observed the branching projections without dismissing them, without selecting one immediately. She said that choice introduced risk. Ethan said that choice also introduced agency. The word settled between them, heavy and precise. In that moment, the Queen understood that fate was not something imposed by systems or lineage alone but something shaped by decisions made in uncertainty. She did not announce this realization. She did not need to. The station registered it anyway, allowing the branches to remain open, just a little longer, long enough for a future to be chosen rather than assigned. The first true test did not arrive with alarms or raised voices but with absence, a subtle withdrawal of automated support that Ethan noticed as soon as he stepped into the core maintenance ring and felt the temperature drift outside its usual tolerance by a narrow but deliberate margin. He paused, listening to the station's hum, recognizing the pattern of a system placed under observation rather than failure. Queen Xyrith arrived moments later, her presence marked not by entourage but by the way the space seemed to still around her. She told him that the council had authorized a stress evaluation, one designed to measure how far recent deviations could persist without centralized correction. Ethan asked whether the evaluation included human parameters. She said that it did now. They moved together along the ring, data shimmering across curved surfaces, projections branching and recombining in slow motion. The deviation widened slightly, airflow adjusting, power redistribution lagging by seconds rather than milliseconds. None of it was dangerous, but all of it demanded attention. Ethan felt the familiar pull to intervene immediately, to smooth the system back into alignment, yet he resisted, recalling his own words about visible failure and learning. He asked Queen Xyrith what outcome the council expected. She replied that they expected confirmation that control could be reasserted at any moment. Ethan nodded, then asked what she expected. She answered honestly that she expected to see whether restraint could be as instructive as action. The station chimed softly again, marking the next phase of the evaluation. A secondary system hesitated, its redundancy delayed, creating a cascade of minor inefficiencies that began to interact in unexpected ways. Ethan traced the interactions mentally, recognizing a point where intervention would prevent unnecessary strain without erasing the lesson unfolding. He looked to the Queen. She watched him closely, not commanding, not forbidding, simply waiting. Ethan made his choice. He intervened narrowly, adjusting a single parameter by a small increment, allowing the broader pattern to continue while preventing a compounding error that would have taught nothing except caution. The station responded, stabilizing without reverting, a compromise between control and exploration. Queen Xyrith observed the result, her expression unreadable. She asked him why he had acted there and not earlier. Ethan explained that timing mattered, that intervention too early prevented understanding and intervention too late created damage that obscured the original cause. He said that humans often learn this distinction through costly mistakes and that he preferred to learn it through attention. The evaluation continued, each phase introducing new variables, each decision carrying weight beyond its immediate effect. At one point, a projection suggested that removing the human variable entirely would return the system to optimal predictability. Queen Xyrith did not dismiss the projection. She studied it, then asked Ethan whether he believed predictability was the same as success. Ethan answered that predictability described the past more accurately than it guaranteed the future. The projection remained on the display, unselected. As the final phase approached, the station's ambient light shifted again, signaling that the council was observing in real time. Pressure settled into the space, not physical but conceptual, the weight of expectation pressing for a definitive outcome. A final deviation emerged, one that would resolve itself only through either full automation or deliberate human-guided adjustment. Queen Xyrith turned to Ethan and asked him what he would do if his guidance were rejected. Ethan said that he would accept the decision and continue to act with integrity within whatever boundaries remained. She asked whether that acceptance would weaken his resolve. Ethan replied that resolve grounded in choice did not depend on authority for its strength. The moment stretched. The station waited. The Queen made her choice. She authorized Ethan's guidance, not as an override but as a recognized input, a formal acknowledgement that his quiet humanity had become part of the system's functioning. Ethan adjusted the final parameter with care, watching as the station resolved into a new equilibrium, not perfectly optimized but robust, flexible, alive with possibility. The council's observation ended without comment. When the ambient settings eased, Queen Xyrith remained still, gaze fixed on the stabilized projections. She said that the evaluation had revealed something unexpected. Ethan asked what that was. She answered that control did not diminish when shared thoughtfully and that fate, like systems, responded differently when choice was allowed to participate. In the quiet that followed, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle, not as a burden but as a trust. He did not celebrate. He simply stood beside her, present, as the station adjusted to a future no longer confined to a single predicted path. The realization did not arrive as a revelation but as a quiet alignment, a convergence of variables that Queen Xyrith recognized not on a display but within herself as she stood with Ethan before the stabilized projections, watching the station settle into a rhythm that was no longer perfectly predictable yet unmistakably sound. She dismissed the remaining observers with a gesture that required no confirmation, and the space grew quieter still, the kind of quiet that followed a decision rather than preceded. 1. She asked Ethan to walk with her beyond the core ring, into a private transit that descended toward a chamber few entered without purpose. The lighting warmed incrementally as they moved, the air carrying a subtle organic note that signaled proximity to the genetic archives, a place of records and futures measured with equal precision. Ethan followed without comment, attentive to the change in gravity gradient, to the way the station seemed to recognize her intent before it was spoken aloud. When the transit opened, the chamber revealed itself as neither ceremonial nor clinical but something between, walls lined with living interfaces that responded to presence with gentle illumination. Queen Xyrith stopped at the threshold and spoke without turning, saying that her people had always believed fate to be an emergent property of optimization, the inevitable outcome of selecting the best variables and removing the rest. She said that mocking breeding with a lone human had once felt like an obvious conclusion, a statement of efficiency rather than cruelty. Ethan listened, his gaze steady, his hands relaxed, understanding that this was not an apology but an accounting. She turned then, meeting his eyes at level distance, and said that the system had recalculated since his arrival, not because of his biology but because of his choices, the way he had acted without demanding relevance. She said that the council would frame this as an anomaly, a temporary perturbation to be studied and contained. She said that she would frame it differently. Ethan asked how. She replied that she would acknowledge a limitation in their model, that they had optimized outcomes while underweighting dignity, and that the omission had been invisible until it was named. The chamber responded to her voice, interfaces brightening, pathways opening in anticipation of instruction. She asked Ethan whether humans believed destiny could be revised. He answered that humans believed destiny was a story told after decisions were made, and that revision was simply another decision, taken later than ideal but still in time. The Queen considered this, then extended her authority into the system with a calm precision that made the station hum deepen by a fraction. She authorized a reclassification, not of Ethan as a variable but of choice itself as a recognized factor in future projections, assigning it weight without defining its limits. The archives responded, models branching again, this time without immediate pressure to collapse into a single path. Ethan felt the significance of the moment not as triumph but as gravity, the sense that something fundamental had shifted without spectacle. Queen Xyrith turned to him and said that fate, as she had understood it, was efficient but narrow, and that humanity, as he embodied it, had widened the frame. She said that this did not obligate her to outcomes she could not predict, but it obligated her to allow them. Ethan replied that allowance was often where responsibility truly began. She asked him whether he feared what might follow. Ethan said that fear was a familiar companion and that it did not have to be an enemy to be acknowledged. The chamber's interfaces dimmed slightly, settling into a steady glow that suggested readiness rather than urgency. Queen Zyrith issued a final directive, recorded and immutable, stating that future bonds would be evaluated not solely by statistical success but by informed consent and mutual agency, terms that had never before appeared together in their archives. The system accepted the directive without resistance. Silence followed, deep and resonant, the kind that marked an ending and a beginning at once. Queen Zyrith stood taller, not in assertion of power but in acceptance of consequence, and for the first time since her ascension, she felt the future open rather than close around her. She looked at Ethan, not as a lone human or a useful anomaly, but as the one who had stood quietly where laughter once had been and refused to leave, and she understood that her fate had changed not because of breeding or biology but because she had chosen to see humanity as more than noise in the system. Ethan met her gaze and said nothing, because nothing more was required. The station adjusted around them, recording the moment without fanfare, carrying it forward as a new baseline, a reminder that in a universe ruled by optimization, mercy could still be measured and choice could still matter. The station entered a new equilibrium without announcement, its systems no longer correcting every divergence but observing them, learning their contours the way a living thing learned its own boundaries. Ethan noticed the change in small ways, in how corridors no longer hurried him along predetermined paths, in how ambient lighting adjusted not just to presence but to pace. Queen Zyrith noticed it in the reports she no longer received, the absence of urgent correction speaking louder than any alarm. The council convened again, this time not to evaluate deviations but to interpret outcomes, and for the first time in her reign, she did not feel compelled to lead them toward a single conclusion. She allowed disagreement to surface, allowed projections to remain open-ended, and found that authority did not erode as a result. It redistributed. Ethan stood beside her during the address not as a symbol or a representative but as himself, a quiet human whose presence no longer required explanation. When the session ended, there was no formal acknowledgement, no declaration of alliance or bond. There did not need to be. Later, in the observation deck overlooking the biome, Queen Zyrith stood barefoot once more, watching the flora respond to natural variation, growth patterns no longer symmetrical yet unmistakably strong. She asked Ethan whether humans marked moments like this with ceremony. Ethan answered that sometimes they did and sometimes they simply remembered, letting the memory guide future choices. She nodded, accepting that answer as sufficient. Silence settled comfortably between them, not heavy with expectation but open, spacious. Ethan felt a familiar pull toward action, toward finding the next system to improve, but he resisted, recognizing that presence itself could be enough. Queen Zyrith spoke again, her voice thoughtful, saying that she had once believed laughter was a shield against inefficiency, a way to dismiss what did not fit the model. She said that she now understood laughter could also be a boundary drawn too early, a way to avoid seeing what might matter later. Ethan listened, saying nothing, understanding that the realization was hers alone. She turned to him and said that fate, as her people had defined it, was no longer sufficient, and that she would not return to that definition. She did not ask for his agreement. She did not need it. The station's core rotated steadily below them, its movement no longer a symbol of inevitability but of continuity shaped by choice. Ethan thought of Earth, of systems far messier and less elegant, of people who stumbled forward without models to guide them, and he felt a quiet certainty that humanity's greatest strength had never been efficiency. It had been the willingness to stand in uncertainty and act with care anyway. Queen Zyrith seemed to sense the shift in his thoughts, her gaze softening, not into sentiment but into recognition. She said that her fate had changed because she had chosen to listen where she once would have dismissed, and that choice had altered everything that followed. Ethan replied that listening was often the first act of change and rarely the last. As the cycle ended, the station dimmed into a rest phase, not commanded but adopted, a shared pause reflecting a new rhythm. Queen Zyrith remained at the railing, taller than any around her, yet unburdened by the need to dominate the space. Ethan stood beside her, not as a savior or a conqueror, but as a human who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. In the quiet that followed, the stars beyond the viewport reflected faintly in the polished surfaces, and for the first time, they did not look distant or cold. They looked like possibilities, waiting not to be optimized, but to be chosen.